To those of us who are joining online, we're have our speaker, Jerry Heebner, is going to be speaking on Martin Brumbaugh. And I just want to note our April talk is on April 12th at noon, and it's by Jeff Marshall, and it's on barnstorming through Eastern Pennsylvania. Mr. Marshall is a barn historian and is going to be talking about the elements and features that make barns special. So that will also be an enjoyable talk. So thank you, Jerry. I'm looking forward to your program.
Thank you for everybody who came out today. Martin Brumbaugh, how did I become interested in Martin Brumbaugh? For those of you who may have looked at the curved wall downstairs behind what used to be the reception desk, there is a picture of Martin Brumbaugh, and I didn't know anything about the man. So I thought, well, this might be somebody to pursue. And I found online a book, this book here, and it was a biography of him. After I read the biography, I decided that he would be my hero. We don't use the terms hero these days. To me, a hero is someone you admire or look up to. Well, after reading the book, he is somebody that I can look up to. And I hope by the end of this presentation, maybe you will share my viewpoint. Well, we're off to a great start here.
It's actually going to come here.
It's going to work from now on. Okay. Okay, I hope to give you a sense of who Martin Brumbaugh was, his values, what he accomplished, and how he should be remembered. His parents brought him up with the Church of the Brethren values, which correspond greatly with Schwenkfelder beliefs, although they may be a little bit more conservative. They are represented locally by the Indian Creek Church in Vernfield and the Peter Becker Retirement Community. He worked long and hard, applying Christian values to his lifestyle and urging others to follow his example. As a child, Martin went to a one-room schoolhouse and was educated by rote learning and proved to be very intelligent. He was raised on a farm, and later in life, he referred to himself as a country boy. He was associated with education his whole life. First locally, then in Louisiana, followed by time in Puerto Rico, after which he came back to Philadelphia and finally was recognized throughout Pennsylvania. So how is Martin Brumbaugh a Schwenkfelder descendant? Abraham Beyer was married to Rosina Yackel before the Schwenkfelders' departure from Europe in the 1730s. Their grandson, Henry, changed his surname from Beyer to Boyer for some unknown reason. Okay, so how did the Boyer family become acquainted with the Brumbaugh family? Or more specifically, how did Rachel Boyer meet Jacob Brumbaugh? And we don't know. A Jacob Brumbaugh and his parents came to Pennsylvania in 1754 and settled briefly in Norristown. That family moved to Western Maryland and became a frontier farmers, and then moved northward back into Pennsylvania to an area named Morrison's Cove in Woodbury Township near Bedford. They settled near the town, or more properly, the borough of Markelsburg. It's unclear whether the Jacob Brumbaugh that married Rachel and having 8 children and living in Penn Township of Huntington County in the 1850s federal census is the grandson or the great-grandson of the original Jacob Brumbaugh. On April 17, 1855, George Boyer Brumbaugh was 6 weeks shy of the age of 21 when he married Martha Heidel Grove, who was 2 years older than him. George was an outgoing person who cared about everyone, perhaps too much. He owned a mercantile or general store in the middle of Markelsburg. And incidentally, that store was passed down to his son, Irvin, who is Martin Brumbaugh's brother, and then to Irvin's son, Randall, who operated it until the late 1900s. George was the pastor at the James Creek Brethren Church and a spiritual leader to the townfolk. At various times, he took on the positions of school director, council member, and burgess, which in Pennsylvania equates to mayor. He was also a pacifist and did not serve in the Civil War, even though he was in his late 20s. First and foremost, though, he was a gregarious humanitarian and who, because of his outgoing personality, acquired the name Talkin' George. As an example, as a gentle shopkeeper, he extended credit to those who were not able to pay, which took a toll on the Brumbaugh household. George began to buy nearby forested acreage. His plan was to put some of the debtors to work cutting down trees, which he would then sell to the lumber mills down the river. Eventually, though, George became a debtor to the bank. A deal was struck that the bank would extend credit to George's son, Martin, with the understanding that he, instead of his father, would see that the sum was paid off by the time he reached the age of 21. To get an idea of George Brumbaugh's neighborhood, we can look at a current map of the Raystown Lake area. Markelsburg is about the size of Green Lane Borough. To the northeast is the borough of Huntingdon. Note that it is Huntingdon, not T-O-N. In 1973, a dam was built on the Raystown branch of the Juniata River to act as a flood control and to create a recreational park. So the lake did not exist in George Brumbaugh's time. The family homestead is shown in yellow on the map. You can see it here. Was called Timothy Meadows, possibly because of the presence of Timothy Hay. Northeast of the homestead is the site of the Valley View Cemetery, also known as the Brumbaugh Cemetery. That's because the Brumbaughs most likely owned the ground, and there are several Brumbaughs buried there, including George and his wife, Martha. Martin G. Brumbaugh has a large gravestone near the rear of the cemetery, and both of Martin's wives are adjacent to him. Near the cemetery entrance along PA Highway 26 is a state highway marker noting the presence of Martin Brumbaugh's gravesite. Martin completed his 2-year Bachelor of English curriculum and simultaneously taught school. He also grew in height and stature. He spent the summers of 1880 and 1881 working at the logging and sawmill operation, which greatly enhanced his physique. Among other jobs, he helped fell white pine trees. Once down, the trees had the bark removed before being cut into 16-foot lengths and dragged to a loading site. In the summer of 1883, he and his father won an order for 1,137 35-foot long chestnut telegraph poles from the Pennsylvania Railroad. They floated the branded, and branded meaning like cattle branding, poles down to a holding pen on Rays Creek, where it joins the Juniata River. Unfortunately, a violent storm in the Huntingdon area broke the boom and scattered the logs as far as Harrisburg, 100 miles away. Recovering them was a Herculean task by Martin and his father, George. In the end, though, they recovered every pole and cleared $2,100 and got George out of debt. Learning in Martin's day was largely by memorization, and he was an excellent student as well as a voracious reader. In addition to his lesson books, he liked to read novels about life in the Wild West. He developed a fondness for fishing that lasted his whole life. As the 1870s approached, a recession set in across the country, and small communities suffered as well as the larger towns. For more than a decade, the brethren had been engaged in serious dialogue over two interrelated questions. One was, is learning a good thing? The other was, if so, should there be private brethren schools beyond 8th grade? Some argued that too much sticking of the pages. Some argued that too much education would cause the church to lose membership to larger denominations. As a case in point, George's younger brother, Andrew, had gotten a degree in medicine from the University of Penn. He left the farm and set up his practice in the nearby town of Huntington, with a population of just over 4,000. Andrew was pushing the case for more brethren schooling. Other family members joined the cause, and before long, a normal school was set up in nearby Huntington, and Martin attended it. Normal schools would later become state teachers' colleges throughout the state. He lived with an uncle while attending college there and took odd jobs to pay his way. It was the president, Jacob Zuck, who spotted Martin's strength toward teaching and recommended that he take the test to become a provisional teacher or a teacher in training, and teaching became his lifetime career. At the young age of 22, he ran for the position of Huntington County Superintendent of Schools and won. Martin wanted to ensure that the school directors who elected him by one vote, 111 to 110, would put into practice a plan and see that the teachers knew how to instruct their students in learning to read, write, and do arithmetic, or cipher, as it was known then. His responsibilities as superintendent put him in charge of 9,000 school-aged children, 235 teachers, whose average age was 22, and 200 school buildings. It was his job to visit each school and evaluate the teachers. He found that many schoolhouses were in sad condition and that some teachers were not fit to teach. So he began setting standards to weed out unfit applicants. He devised rigorous qualifying tests and was gratified by the quick results. What bothered him most was the lack of knowledge of how to teach. Teachers' institutes were set up after the Civil War for just this purpose, and Brumbaugh urged those who wanted to teach to attend the institutes. He himself had attended one and saw the benefits of going. He encouraged the local officials who employed the teachers to send them for institute learning. Pennsylvania at that time ranked as the leading state in institute work. As he moved about Huntington County, he urged the children to stay in school and the teachers to attend normal school, such as a brethren school in Huntington, to acquire the needed skills. He also wanted teachers to add art and music to the curriculum. On the morning of Thursday, August 28, 1884, he married Anna Konigmacher, who was a year older than him. She was from Ephrata and a student at the Brethren Normal School when they met. They had ample time to get together as she boarded at Uncle Henry Brumbaugh's home in Huntington. The couple bore 2 children, Mabel and George Edwin. George Edwin being the names of his 2 grandfathers. Mabel Brumbaugh married Ralph Loires and raised their son Kenneth. She died just short of her 84th birthday. Her brother, G. Edwin, became a Philadelphia architect who was concerned with historic preservation. Most notably, he was involved with the restoration of the Ephrata Cloister, Daniel Boone Homestead, Independence Hall, and the Edward Morgan Log House outside Lansdale, Pennsylvania. Edwin died in 1983 at the ripe old age of 93. Martin Brumbaugh's name and fame began to spread across the state of Pennsylvania. His ability to organize and develop teachers and school districts was recognized by Pennsylvania State Superintendent of Instruction, Elisha Higbee. When Colonel Thomas Boyd of Louisiana contacted Higbee for a recommendation on someone to come to the Deep South in the summers, Higbee's first choice was M.G. Brumbaugh. In 1889, Louisiana's school system was in deplorable condition, with nearly 50% of the youth being illiterate. Private schools funded by parents or the church existed, but no public schools. Private schools, during the 4 summers he spent in Louisiana, Brumbaugh had to push for funding of the school buildings, school supplies, and educated teachers for normal schools by the public. Segregation was rampant as well. Some Louisianians place here. Some Louisianians spoke of Brumbaugh as being a popular evangelist because of the way he transferred teaching in public schools into a kind of religious obligation in a democratic society. It was said that he moved audiences by eloquence, anecdotes, humor, and feeling in a conversational tone of voice. During the final decade of the 19th century, he enrolled first at Harvard and later at the University of Pennsylvania to obtain his doctorate degree. This also brought him to the attention of educators in Philadelphia. The Brumbaugh families ran Huntington Normal College, and they determined that Martin should be the next president of the college after gaining his doctorate degree. MG was concurrently offered the presidency of Louisiana State University and head of pedagogy at Penn University. Taking less pay, but staying true to his Brethren roots, he returned to Huntington with his 293 students. Martin favored changing the school name to Juniata College and broadening the curriculum to include liberal arts courses. Despite a nationwide depression that was taking place in the mid-1890s, in a spirit of rejuvenation, ground was broken for a 4-story classroom brick building to be known as Students' Hall. The University of Pennsylvania offered Martin an opportunity to teach a single graduate course on Friday night and Saturday morning, which he accepted. This meant he commuted between Philadelphia and Huntington every weekend for 9 months. His boundless energy had him giving speeches at other institutes, making one wonder when he was at home during this time. He even managed to tour England and Europe in the summer of 1896. During that summer, he determined that his family would be moving to Philadelphia, and he would use September to organize things at Juniata and come back to teach courses in May of the following year. In the meantime, he would occasionally visit during the interlude. While all his absence from home, it was decided to hire a nanny to help Anna raise the children. Their choice was Martin's fifth cousin, Flora Bell Parks, who was 13 years younger than he was. He was elected president of the fledgling Pennsylvania State Teachers Association, and in an early address to the group, pointed out how much the Germans had preserved the ideals of William Penn's Holy Experiment. As MG's popularity expanded throughout the state and beyond, Brother Frank Brumbaugh became concerned that Martin was abandoning his Brethren roots. While education was his main interest, Martin had long devoted time to the genealogy field, particularly the German background of the Brumbaugh name. He traveled to Europe to research his religious background and the Brumbaugh name. He joined the Pennsylvania German Society and promoted the fact that many German immigrants were intelligent, contrary to widespread opinion. They tended to be farmers rather than city folk, and thus were not in need of higher education. In 1899, Brumbaugh published a history of the German Baptist Brethren, which took a revisionist look at Dunker origins and appealed to brotherhood progressives. His genealogy interests put him in touch with Abraham H. Castle, a Harleysville, Pennsylvania descendant of both the German printer Christopher Sauer and the colonial preacher Peter Becker. It is reported that Castle had amassed over 50,000 items, books, magazines, newspapers, tracts, and pamphlets. In 1898, Castle, with his eyesight failing, decided to sell off his collection, and Brumbaugh made a pitch for moving it to Juniata College campus, where it could reside indefinitely. When negotiations were completed, about 1/3 of the collection was relocated to Juniata College. Another literary contribution Martin made was Stories of Pennsylvania in collaboration with Joseph Walton. It had a dual purpose. One was to tell the magnificent history of events that occurred in Pennsylvania, and the other was to interest students in reading books. His more noteworthy publication at the close of the 19th century was a 5-volume set of Brumbaugh standard readers, which offered gradual learning through the grades, the first being for the early grades and the last being for the upper grades. Around this time, there was unrest in the Caribbean. The battleship Maine was blown up in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. The Spanish-American War was underway. When the smoke of the war had lifted, the United States found itself to be a world power. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 added Puerto Rico to American territory, and a valuable acquisition because of its location in the Caribbean Sea. One of the early concerns was the lack of formal education for so many of the people. Only the well-to-do were schooled. Teaching children for all others was done sometimes outdoors and often by unqualified teachers. In a population of nearly 1 million, the census of 1899 classed 88% of the people as illiterate. To rectify this, the United States government sought someone with the ability to organize and develop a comprehensive plan of education. Of course, the name of Martin Brumbaugh was proposed. After he initially turned the position down, he was brought to the office of President of the U.S., William McKinley, who suggested it was Brumbaugh's patriotic duty to take the job for 2 years. When put that way, Martin felt he had no choice but to serve. He received an unpaid leave of absence from the University of Pennsylvania for the time period and jumped into preparing a plan. Like any other endeavor that he tackled, Brumbaugh threw himself wholeheartedly into this effort. After reading reports of others, he devised a plan to first teach the teachers and stimulate the newly formed government to put more money and resources into education. He encouraged private schools, some of religious origin, to aid in the spreading of learning for all. Most of the inhabitants understood Spanish, so teaching them was done in the native tongue. But Martin wanted them to learn English as well. Acquiring buildings or constructing new buildings dedicated to education was a priority. He traveled about the island, often late into the night, seeing for himself that his requests were being carried out. The people of Puerto Rico accepted public schooling enthusiastically and devoted themselves to making the new reforms an unqualified success. He became a hero to many and was able to claim accomplishment after 2 years' time. As the year 1900 was drawing to a close, Martin knew that he wanted to return to the University of Pennsylvania as his leave of absence was coming to an end. He sent his letter of resignation to President Teddy Roosevelt, who had succeeded William McKinley upon his assassination. Before departing, with the help of Andrew Carnegie, he was able to found the first public library in the capital city of San Juan. Martin took up teaching at the University of Penn and saw to the publication of the second edition of his Fifth Reader. By May of 1902, he was back in the swing of things, offering commencement speeches at college and even the high school in Columbus, Ohio. In early 1903, Brumbaugh began his long public identification with Sunday school work. Prior to his Puerto Rico stint, he was active in the Philadelphia Brethren Church and had taught once a week at the Biblical Institute of New York. His first national exposure as a Sunday school enthusiast came in the summer of 1902, when he gave a major address at the International Sunday School Association in Denver, Colorado. There were educators that saw a benefit in both Sunday school and public school. In 1903, the Religious Education Association, the REA, sprang up to incorporate the values of the two schools. Martin's involvement in the REA began in April 1903, when he was appointed to its Department of Teacher Training. An ideal recruit because his reputation as an educator had spread across America and in Pennsylvania as a churchman. It was Brumbaugh who first introduced teacher training for Sunday schools, and with a class of 50 students getting education from him at nighttime. He favored no particular religion, but gave instruction on how one should teach the lessons. He already had the reputation of spiritualizing public education as service for God and for country, in that order. He preached that educators, above all, must exemplify Christian ideals. As Philadelphia's superintendent of schools, he became a prophetic voice for moral training in the public schools. The progressive era in the United States history saw the transition from a farming society to one of urban life and an industrial economy. This created complex social and economic problems in the form of political corruption, societal injustices, monopolies, crowded cities, increased organized crime, and rampant poverty. Urban population tripled between 1860 and 1900. They argued that the government must become an agency of human welfare. The city of Philadelphia was a prime example of corruption at every level. But there was one combative individual, John Wanamaker, and he became a confidant of Martin Brumbaugh. In 1903, Brumbaugh was back in Pennsylvania and was elected vice president of the Public Education Association. At that time, principals and teachers owed their jobs to political leaders, and they were expected to contribute a portion of their earnings to the political party that gave them their job. Brumbaugh was outraged and began a campaign for a study of the education system in 8 major cities. It became evident that the education system was woefully underfunded. Martin, as part of an educational commission, helped spearhead a bill to overcome this deficiency. It was a bill that would be signed into law by Governor Samuel W. Pennypacker, who became a friend of the Schwenkfelders. The new law reduced the Central Board of Education to 21 members who controlled the teacher's fate. They met to find a new superintendent of schools in Philadelphia. The choices boiled down to 2, Dr. Cheeseman Herrick and Martin Brumbaugh. Eventually, Brumbaugh prevailed. Interesting, Martin was also being considered as president of Penn State at the time, but he wrote a letter stating that he was not interested in the position without an explanation as to why he was declining. It was about this time that Brumbaughs were looking for a summer vacation spot away from the sweltering heat of Philadelphia. After receiving recommendations, they settled on a home in Wayne, Maine, an inland property on the Androscoggin Lake. Brumbaugh, in his new position of superintendent of schools in the city of Philadelphia, found many deficiencies. Some children were enrolled in half-day classes, and some were sharing a room where 2 grades were taught in the same room. Others were in rented buildings that were so antiquated and in such disrepair that they were deemed to be health and safety hazards. An insufficient number of desks meant that pupils sat on benches. He began a campaign to build more schools and hire more teachers, including minority teachers. In 1907, he worked with socialite Mrs. Edwin Grice to form the National Congress of Mothers, later to become the National Congress of Parents and Teachers, and a forerunner of today's Parent-Teachers Associations. One of the early projects for this group was to ensure that every school had a playground. A year later, in 1908, he found time to author and have published a volume titled The Life and Works of Christopher Dock, a compilation of Dock's works in the original German and translated into English. In that same year, 1908, he was elected to the prestigious American Philosophical Society. This brings us to a philosophy that has long been espoused by Brumbaugh. He complained that the nation's secular-based schools neglected teaching religious and moral values. Recognizing that the Constitution forbids the state from engaging in the practice, Sunday schools must fill the purpose, he said, and so he joined the Religious Education Association. He wanted the schools to become neighborhood social centers. All of this promotional activity raised some opposition, and Martin began to be pulled into the politics of the day. The Brumbaughs moved to Germantown section of Philadelphia in March 1912. They bought a 3-story stone structure at 254 West Walnut Lane, which had served as a British field hospital at the Revolutionary Battle of Germantown. Just a few blocks away was the original Church of the Brethren, founded in 1723. The estate was the pride of the neighborhood when they sold it some years later. Today, unfortunately, it's run down along with other nearby homes. As 1913 drew to a close, Brumbaugh's time in office was also nearing its end. One major success that he could point to was the increase in teachers' salaries during his time of leadership. He was particularly instrumental in getting pay rates for female teachers to be commensurate with the male counterparts. For quite some time, Martin had planned to travel to Europe. So in the fall of 1913, Martin, Anna, and companion Flora acted upon those plans with a tour of England, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, and Switzerland. They ended in Zurich, where Martin was a delegate and star speaker at an international Sunday school convention. He also served as world president of the International Congress on Home Education that met in Ghent, Belgium, while they were there. Upon his return to the States, he was met by a school board that had two factions that couldn't agree on some matters. The primary issue he had to settle was the naming of a principal to one of the high schools. Martin left his position the following spring, at which time former Governor Samuel Pennypacker floated the idea that he should be run for governor of Pennsylvania. Martin Brumbaugh was first and foremost an educator. That was his passion. He remained untouchably independent of political intrigue in his work as a member of the State Board of Education. Pennsylvania, however, was notorious for machine-run Republican politics, the leader being a man named Boys Penrose, who came from a wealthy Philadelphia family. Another faction was led by William S. Vere, who was a strong supporter of education, and because of that interest, he saw what Brumbaugh was doing for the public school system. A deal was struck. Penrose would support Brumbaugh for governor, and Vere's support of him for U.S. Senator. Many brethren felt that if Martin had spent a little more time in prayer, he would have turned down the candidacy. There were those in the church who felt that it was scripturally wrong to become involved in politics. Brumbaugh responded that it would bring the brethren faith into public notice, and he would put the church principles to work in the political arena. He won every county in the state and captured nearly 80% of the total vote of the Republican candidate for governor. After campaigning and post-primary election hullabaloo, the Brumbaughs decided to relax a bit at their main home before the fall general election. Upon their arrival on Sunday, May 24th, Anna Brumbaugh, in quotes, took sick. Her condition worsened and they returned to Philadelphia, where a doctor diagnosed her ailment as acute general tuberculosis. For years, she had been a near invalid, and now on Sunday, June 28th, she was gone. At a time when he would typically be in mourning, he was forced to put that aside. We can only speculate that he may have known he was soon going to be a widower, for he ambitiously dove into the campaign. 1 month later, World War I began in Europe. Martin grew up on a farm and provided him with ready communication with rural folks. Independents and Democrats liked what he had to say. It was said that the gubernatorial race was settled by personalities rather than issues. One issue that was on everybody's mind was alcohol. Martin preferred to make it a local issue where each county would decide whether it would allow sales of alcohol. A third political party, the Washington Party, sprang up with the backing of former President Theodore Roosevelt. Their candidate, Gifford Pinchot, was never a threat to the Republican stronghold. Martin made a point of telling everyone that he was not part of the Republican machine which gained favor with the public, but caused him grief after he was elected. Brumbaugh and Penrose would become bitter enemies within the party, and the incoming governor would win about 70,000 more votes than the Senator Penrose. After the election, he left by train for Southern Pines, North Carolina, to take a 3-week rest. There he played golf for the first time at Pinehurst Country Club. He would come to enjoy it as much as fishing. In his inaugural address, he stated that there were too many laws, and his administration would offer only a few critical ones. The statement was met with great applause. Significantly fewer people applauded his desire to give women the right to vote. Another unusual aspect to his speech at that time was his invocation to God for divine help to do his job. He would certainly need it because the pride of the neighborhood was when they sold it. He would certainly need it because of the contentiousness between Brumbaugh Ver and Crow Penrose factions began with the first legislative session when a speaker needed to be elected. One of the early critical laws was a restriction on an underage 16 child's labor, except on the farm. The law was giving counties the choice to be wet or dry, never made it to the public as it was defeated in the House and Senate. One bill that did pass was a $50 million bond issue for highway construction. Martin was known for vetoing many laws that were, quote, pork-laden, unquote, with unnecessary expenditures. He made 2 major excursions in 1915. The first was a train trip to San Francisco for the Panama Pacific Exposition, where he gave extemporaneous speeches along the way extolling Pennsylvania. The other was a circuitous route around the newly paved roads in the state to make the public aware of the accomplishment. A year later, he surprised most of the public with his marriage to his longtime companion, Flora Bell Parks, on Friday, January 29th, 1916. Perhaps it was because she was 13 years younger than him. Their honeymoon took them back to Pinehurst Country Club in North Carolina. Later that spring, after the press had made much out of the purpose of a check that he had given to David Oliver, he decided he was not going to run for president of the United States. He instead would back Supreme Court Justice Charles Hughes as the Republican candidate. Hughes would narrowly lose to Woodrow Wilson in the 1916 contest. Today, we are familiar with the disparity between the 2 major political parties. The 1917 General Assembly began with 2 factions of the same party, the Republican Party. By today's standards, the Brumbaugh-Ver group would be described as conservative, and the Crow-Penrose-led group would be considered liberal. Newspapers of that day would favor one side or the other in reporting legislation, and it should be remembered that only men had the right to vote. Brumbaugh promoted the plan to give women the right to vote, but it would take 2 more years before women's suffrage was enacted across the country. The Penrose-led faction threatened the new governor with impeachment. Martin enjoyed his cigars, but he never drank any alcoholic beverages, and prohibition was a hot topic during this time period. The local option for allowing the sales of alcohol was being overtaken by the national prohibition legislation, and Martin chose to endorse that idea. He was opposed to capital punishment, but failed to get support of his position of it. He did get backing for his plan to raise teachers' salaries because qualified educators were leaving the profession to take better paying jobs in industry. He also began a pension system for retired teachers. After war came to this country, Brumbaugh could not imagine a defeated United States. It was his sense of eternal right and justice that triumphed over his brethren pacifist ethic after America declared war. As a member of the Valley Forge Park Commission, he attended the unveiling of the Washington Memorial Arch at the entrance to the park in June 1917. It is reported that about 1/3 of Pennsylvanians at that time were of German descent. So activating a state National Guard to fight against Germany in Europe was not all that popular. Nevertheless, he mobilized the Guard to be prepared to go overseas and proceeded to form a stay-at-home backup guard to replace the national contingency. Statistics indicate that the state was a major player in the war effort due to the unwavering support of the governor. As he was leaving office in 1918, the disastrous Spanish flu struck, and once again the state was in the forefront of providing many doctors and nurses to the Red Cross as they battled the epidemic. Morton's time in office coincided with the emergence of the Brethren from a self-imposed cultural quarantine into an increasing identification with the wider society. Traditional taboos against voting, holding office, and social activisms became passé. In January 1919, Martin Brumbaugh, at 56 years of age, found himself an ex-governor without a job and without a pension. The wartime draft revealed the extent that youth were failing in physical fitness, as 37% could not pass their physicals. In addition, it was also exposed widespread illiteracy was present. Solving the two challenges became Martin's goal during the 1919 to 1924 time period, while working as a spokesman for the National Physical Education Service. He felt it was important for all citizens and immigrants to be fluent in English. Meanwhile, students at Juniata College began to demonstrate and wanted more say on campus activities. The college board determined that Martin was the only person that could ease the situation and appealed to him to return as president of the college. As president, he needed to be nearer the campus than Philadelphia. So the Brumbaughs moved to the Mission House because there was no official house designated for the president. It was essentially an upstairs apartment. What a change in lifestyle. He now became a mediator between the conservative board members and the ever-growing liberal scholastic class members. In his new position, he felt that fundraising was a major need and invited several well-to-do Pennsylvanians to the campus. But he found it distasteful to outright ask them for money. Martin did achieve some of his new objectives. The endowment fund passed the $1 million mark. The college enrollment doubled to over 500 students, which was 4 times the average growth for the other liberal arts schools in Pennsylvania. College Hill now had a men's dormitory of architectural distinction. The library ranked among the best in the state. The faculty received salary increases and sabbaticals, along with a retirement fund and financial assistance for widows. He insisted the Church of the Brethren maintain a strong presence on campus. Upon the advice of his doctor, Martin and Flora went to Pinehurst, North Carolina. Both of the Brumbaughs were proficient golfers, and this would perhaps allow Martin to shake his bad cold in the middle of March. He was on the 8th hole of Pinehurst number 4 course when he collapsed after saying that he felt dizzy. He was carried back to the clubhouse, and Flora, who was also playing golf that day, was summoned. He was conscious to the end, dying in his wife's arms. His last words were, "Flora Belle, I love you. I don't want to leave you." The funeral took place in the chapel of the Juniata campus, with burial taking place in the rain at the Family Valley View Cemetery near Markelsburg, where he began life. A nearby marker along PA Route 25 marks the location. Morning Grove Brumbaugh was a month shy of turning 68 years old when he died on March 14, 1930. In that time span, he accomplished much as an educator, author, and governor. In addition to his other achievements that I reported today, he is credited with supporting many other causes involving public health, banking laws, widows' pensions, support for the blind, food and drug laws, state game preserves, veterans, college benefits, and coal mine safety. While he was a Brethren disciple, he was also a Schwenkfelder descendant of whom we can be proud. Thank you. Do any of you have any comments? Did you know any Brumbaughs? I know we have at least one person here that attended Juniata. Maybe there's some others. Any comments that you would like to make? Well, I must have done a good job then. Okay. Well, so one thing though that I would like to mention, and I write everything down so I catch everything. After putting together my prepared presentation, I keep finding connections to Martin Brumbaugh. First, I was informed that the Heritage Center has a vase with his image on it. We have it here. Apparently, we don't know how we got it, but there it is. Second, we received a donation of books that were sitting on a table back in the mezzanine room. Among the stack was Pennsylvania Stories, which is this book that I referred to, Pennsylvania Stories by Brumbaugh and Walden. So I read a couple of stories in here, and one of them includes the Philadelphia Tea Party. You probably have never heard of the Philadelphia Tea Party, but it's related to the Stamp Act. The people in Philadelphia were not anxious to pay the new tax on the tea. And so when the ship arrived in Philadelphia, incidentally, a month before in Boston, the committee went out to the captain of the ship and said, "You're not unloading it here." The captain turned the ship around and left. So it happened about 1 month before the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party, of course, they threw the tea in the water. Now, the people in Philadelphia were environmentalists and didn't want to ruin the Delaware River any more than it was at that time. But I thought it was interesting. There's several other ones, short stories, but they talk about events that took place in Philadelphia. Took place in Pennsylvania. The third item of my genealogical research has to do with the genealogical record. And just last Friday, when I was up here, I'm going through some papers looking about the history of the genealogical record, which is 100 years old this year. And I came across a paper of Wayne Meister writing a letter to Gaius Brumbaugh, who was a cousin of Martin, and offering him a genealogical record, since Brumbaugh was the family researcher for the Brumbaugh family. So there is another connection. And my brother found online a book on how to teach Sunday school teachers. And the book was published in 1905, so the book is 118 years old. Finally, I want to say that I have an extra copy of the biography of Martin Brumbaugh by Earl C. Kaler. This was my source, and I have 2 of these books. If anyone has an interest in reading about this great man, I'll give you the book. So that's my offer to you folks. Thank you. Bye.